The town of Truro, Nova Scotia, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Nestled among quiet streets and rolling hills, it seemed almost immune to the chaos of the outside world. People left their doors unlocked, neighbors shared meals, and the worst scandal that might make the front page of the local paper was a petty theft or a lost dog. But in the fall of 2015, this little town was about to be shaken in a way no one could have imagined. Catherine Campbell was well known in Truro. At 36 years old, she had become more than just a police officer. She was a symbol of protection, of trust, and of kindness. Colleagues admired her strength and her dedication to the job, while her friends and neighbors knew her as someone who carried warmth in her smile and never hesitated to lend a hand. She wasn't just a cop patrolling the streets, she was someone the community leaned on. But on a September morning, when Catherine failed to show up for her shift, the routine calm of Truro began to unravel. At first, it was brushed off as unusual but not alarming. Police officers, after all, were human. Maybe she had fallen ill, maybe she had taken a personal day and forgotten to call. But as hours stretched into the afternoon, unanswered phone calls piled up, and Catherine's absence could no longer be explained away. When her fellow officers drove by her home, their unease deepened. Her car sat in the driveway, locked and untouched. Her house looked exactly as she had left it. But Catherine herself was nowhere to be found. That night, the police filed her as a missing person. It wasn't just a formality, something about her disappearance felt wrong from the very beginning. Catherine was known for her discipline, for showing up on time, for never abandoning her responsibilities. For her to vanish without a trace was unthinkable. The search began almost immediately. Dozens of officers scoured neighborhoods, knocking on doors, combing through parks, riversides, and wooded trails. Volunteers from the community joined in, flashlights cutting through the night as they called her name. But there was no answer. The more they looked, the more the air grew heavy with a dreadful certainty. Catherine Campbell wasn't just missing, something had happened to her. As the hours turned into days, whispers started moving through Truro. Had she been abducted? Was it possible she had simply left on her own? To most people, the latter theory made no sense. Catherine loved her job, her family, her friends. She had roots in this town. Running away wasn't just out of character, it was impossible to believe. Then came the breakthrough that would shatter any hope of a simple explanation. Surveillance footage from a downtown bar showed Catherine on the night before she disappeared. She wasn't alone. She was with a man, someone most people in Truro didn't recognize. The images were grainy but clear enough to identify him. He was taller, broad-shouldered, walking close beside her as if they were comfortable with each other. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a random encounter, maybe even a date. But for investigators, it was the first sign that Catherine's disappearance was not her choice. Whoever this man was, he was the last person to see her alive. The community watched in disbelief as the news broke. Catherine Campbell, the trusted police officer who had spent her career protecting others, was now the victim of a crime herself. And the man seen with her that night would soon become the prime suspect in one of the darkest cases Truro had ever faced. But what the town didn't know yet was that this wasn't just a simple story of violence. It was a tale of betrayal, obsession, and a chilling darkness hiding behind the most ordinary of faces. And it was only the beginning. The clock had barely crossed midnight when the quiet streets of Truro began to fall silent. Bars and restaurants were closing, neon lights flickering before fading into the stillness of early morning. But somewhere in the darkness of those winding Canadian streets, Catherine Campbell's trail had already begun to fade. The last confirmed image of her, that grainy CCTV clip, replayed over and over in investigators' minds. Catherine walking beside a young man, her body slightly leaning as though tired from the night. Her face was partially obscured, but her posture suggested she wasn't in distress. Not yet. The man, taller, broader, walked confidently, almost as if he knew exactly where they were headed. To anyone else, it was an ordinary scene, two people leaving a bar together. But to police officers reviewing the tape in the days ahead, it was the beginning of something far darker. When Catherine failed to show up for her next shift at the police department, alarms went off instantly. She was not the kind of officer who simply didn't turn up. Her reliability was her reputation. Punctual, disciplined, always accountable. Colleagues tried to call her phone, but the device went straight to voicemail. Within hours, the Truro Police Service realized something was wrong. This wasn't a case of oversleeping after a late night. This was something else entirely. The search began quietly at first. Officers checked her apartment. The front door was locked, the windows shut, everything in place. Her car was still in the driveway, untouched. It was as if Catherine had vanished into thin air after leaving that bar. Her parents were contacted, her closest friends questioned, and the details painted an unsettling picture. She had told a friend earlier in the evening that she planned to meet someone new, someone she had been chatting with online. This small piece of information shifted the tone of the investigation. If Catherine had indeed gone to meet a man, then who was he? And could he be the same figure in the CCTV footage? Police expanded their canvas. They canvassed the streets near the bar, asking local business owners for surveillance recordings. They spoke to taxi drivers, bar staff, and anyone who might have crossed paths with Catherine that night. Slowly, a timeline began to take shape. Catherine left the bar shortly after midnight with a man she appeared to trust. The two walked toward a nearby parking lot. And then, nothing. No more cameras picked them up, no witnesses recalled seeing them further down the road. As hours turned into a full day, Catherine's disappearance made headlines across Nova Scotia. News outlets plastered her photograph across screens: missing police officer, last seen leaving downtown bar. The community reacted instantly. Volunteers showed up to join search parties. People walked through forests, combed riversides, and scoured ditches. Officers with flashlights moved in coordinated lines, their beams cutting through the dense woods on the outskirts of town. The image of uniformed officers searching desperately for one of their own carried a chilling irony. The protectors of the community now frantically trying to protect one of their own who had vanished without a trace. Behind the scenes, detectives were narrowing their focus. They traced Catherine's phone records, credit card transactions, and social media accounts. That's when they uncovered something important. She had indeed been speaking with someone online. A man in his 20s, a local college student, who had a reputation for charm but also for instability. His name surfaced again and again in conversations, and soon investigators began to believe he was the man in the CCTV footage. Meanwhile, Catherine's family clung to hope. Her father stood before news cameras, his voice trembling as he begged for information. "If anyone knows where my daughter is, please, we just want her home safe." But even as he spoke, the tension in the community thickened. This was not a simple missing person case. The longer Catherine remained unseen, the more it felt like something irreversible had happened. By the third day, investigators had built enough probable cause to bring in the young man for questioning. They knocked on his apartment door in the early hours of the morning, their faces grim, their voices sharp. He looked surprised, perhaps even annoyed, when they told him Catherine Campbell's name. He claimed he barely knew her, that they had talked briefly but nothing came of it. But the detectives weren't convinced. They had seen the footage. They knew he had been with her the night she disappeared. And though he tried to mask his unease, small cracks in his story were already showing. What happened after Catherine walked away with him? Where did she go? Why did every trace of her vanish within minutes of leaving the bar? The walls were beginning to close in, and the man at the center of it all was about to face questions he could no longer escape. The icy morning of October 14, 2013, would etch itself into the memory of Valley Creek forever. Just as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the clouds in pale shades of gray, a fisherman made his way down to the banks of the Coldwater River, a place where the town's silence always felt heavier. He had walked this path hundreds of times, casting his line into the calm waters, hoping for trout. But that morning something unusual caught his eye. Half buried in the reeds, tangled in debris carried downstream, lay a shape that the human mind instantly recognizes yet desperately wishes it hadn't seen. At first he thought it was a mannequin, a cruel prank abandoned near the water. But as he moved closer, the truth gripped his chest like a vice. It was a body. He stumbled backward, his hands trembling, his fishing rod clattering against the rocks. With shaking fingers he dialed the police, his voice cracking as he uttered the words, "There's a woman in the river." Within minutes, the quiet stretch of riverbank transformed into a scene of chaos. Police cruisers lined the narrow dirt path, officers stepping carefully over mud and brush. The coroner arrived, their faces tight, eyes avoiding the sight too long, as if the reality was too sharp to bear. The woman pulled from the river was dressed in the same clothes Catherine Miller had last been seen wearing. Though her body was battered from the current, there was no mistaking her identity. The officer everyone in town had been searching for had been found. The town of Valley Creek was stunned into silence. People gathered at the edges of the taped-off area, some with hands over their mouths, others whispering prayers. Catherine wasn't just another missing person. She was one of their own, a police officer, a daughter, a sister, a friend. And now she was gone. The news spread like wildfire. By noon, local media vans crowded the streets, cameras zooming in on every tear-streaked face. For the first time since she vanished, there was no longer hope, only horror. The autopsy began the following morning, and with it came revelations darker than anyone had prepared for. Catherine hadn't simply drowned. The medical examiner found clear signs of struggle: bruises around her neck, scratches on her arms, and blunt force trauma to the back of her head. She had been overpowered, attacked, and murdered before being dumped into the river. The brutality of it sent shockwaves through the department. 4 seasoned detectives, it was a reminder of just how vicious the human heart could become. For Catherine's colleagues, it was personal, rage bubbling beneath their grief. Detective Alan Brooks, who had been leading the search, now swore he would not rest until Catherine's killer was caught. "She wore our badge," he muttered to the team, his jaw clenched tight. "We owe her justice." The investigation shifted gears immediately. Every second of CCTV footage from the bar was re-examined, every witness re-interviewed. The shadowy figure walking beside Catherine that night became their prime suspect. But who was he? The footage was grainy, the man's face never fully visible. Some witnesses remembered him, a stranger, someone not from Valley Creek. He had spoken with Catherine briefly, buying her a drink before the two stepped outside together. Nobody could recall his name. Theories began to swirl. Was he a drifter passing through town? A predator who spotted Catherine alone and took advantage? Or was it someone with a deeper, darker connection to her past? For Catherine's family, grief turned into tormenting questions. Her mother wept as she told reporters, she trusted people. That was her gift, but maybe it was her downfall. The town that once felt safe now carried an invisible weight. Parents no longer let their children walk home after dark. Women traveled in groups. Bars that once thrived at night became deserted. Valley Creek was no longer the kind of town where things like this don't happen. Now, it was the kind of town where a police officer could be murdered in cold blood. But the investigation was only beginning. And as detectives pulled on the threads of Catherine's final hours, a web of betrayal, obsession, and violence slowly began to unravel. The river had given up her body, but it hadn't revealed the full truth. That part was still waiting in the shadows. The days following Catherine Campbell's grim discovery were a whirlwind of activity. Valley Creek, a town that had always prided itself on its tranquility, now felt like a maze of shadows and hidden fears. Every alley, every bar, every friendly face suddenly seemed suspect. Detectives moved through the town like hunters, eyes scanning, notebooks in hand, trying to trace the invisible threads left by a man who had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. Detective Alan Brooks, exhausted but relentless, stared at the bar footage again and again. The grainy video showed Catherine laughing, chatting, her vibrant personality lighting up the dim room. And beside her, the stranger, tall, calm, almost too controlled. Every detail mattered. The way he gestured, the slight smirk, the casual glance at the door. That smile Brooks felt in his gut was the kind that masked something sinister. Witnesses slowly came forward. The cab driver who had taken Catherine from her apartment described her as cheerful, relaxed, and sober. She had no inkling of the horror that awaited her. And yet, the trail ended the moment she stepped into that bar. There were no other CCTV cameras outside. The patrons who remembered the man gave vague descriptions. Early 20s, dark hair, average build, one said. But there was something off about him, whispered another. Detectives now faced a chilling realization. The killer had planned little yet left enough chaos to make the investigation nearly impossible. Every move Catherine had made that night, the cab, the bar, the laughter, now became a haunting memory, each step scrutinized for clues. Then came the break. An officer reviewing traffic cameras on side streets noticed something unusual. A man dragging a large wheeled container across multiple intersections in the early hours. He was calm, deliberate, seemingly unconcerned about being seen. Something about his gait, the careful, measured pull of the container, suggested familiarity with hiding evidence. The detectives matched timestamps and footage from different locations. Every frame reinforced their suspicion. This was no random crime of opportunity. This was a calculated act, executed by someone who believed they would leave no trace behind. Meanwhile, forensic teams scoured the apartment Christopher had shared with his girlfriend. Blood stains, fresh and unmistakable, marred the living room carpet and a pillow where someone had slept. Experts immediately collected samples. Every droplet screamed the same truth. The killer was someone Catherine had encountered closely, someone who had been in her life briefly but fatally. At the police station, the list of possible suspects shrank rapidly. Christopher Grainer's name surfaced, a local man, seemingly ordinary civil servant, no violent record. But his connection to Catherine's final movements was undeniable. Surveillance footage, witness accounts, and a strange set of online searches found on his computer painted a chilling portrait. He had searched for memory loss effects, alcohol, antidepressants, hinting at a calculated defense. "I don't remember," he might claim. It was cold, clinical, yet terrifyingly human. Detective Brooks leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "He's right in front of us," he muttered. "And he thinks he's smarter than all of us." The investigation intensified. Officers watched, followed, and interrogated. Every movement, every lie, every hidden detail slowly tightened the noose around Christopher. But the man remained outwardly calm, blending into the quiet town life, a ghost behind ordinary eyes. The darkness of that night in September 2015 had unleashed a ripple that would consume the town. Catherine's laughter, her hope, her dedication to the community, everything was now a haunting echo. But the detectives were resolute. They would see this through. Justice for Catherine Campbell was no longer a hope, it was an obsession. The morning sun barely touched the quiet streets of Valley Creek when Detective Alan Brooks received the call. A man, 27-year-old Christopher Grainer, was spotted near the bridge where Catherine's body had been found. The tone in the dispatcher's voice was tense, urgent. Everything in the town felt like it was about to collide. Officers quickly surrounded him. Christopher's hands trembled slightly, his face pale, but his calm eyes betrayed nothing. When asked what he was doing, he stammered, mumbling vague excuses. His nervousness was a stark contrast to the meticulous planning that had gone into hiding the crime. Officers decided to search his car immediately. The contents of the trunk were chilling. A rope, a blanket soaked in blood, a backpack with his clothes and passport, a gallon of gasoline, and a lighter. The magnitude of the discovery stunned everyone. He had been driving directly to the secluded bridge, the very spot where Catherine's decomposed body had been found. It was almost too precise, almost deliberate. Christopher was taken to the station for questioning. Silence filled the room as the detectives stared at him, waiting for any sign of remorse or confession. He said little, but the evidence against him was undeniable. The forensic team had already confirmed that blood in his car and apartment matched Catherine Campbell's. The pattern of surveillance footage from bars, streets, and apartments traced his every move with chilling accuracy. A strange set of search histories on his computer further horrified the investigators. Questions about memory loss from alcohol and antidepressants suggested a premeditated defense. Claim amnesia, pretend ignorance, and hope to escape justice. The calculations behind these queries made Detective Brooks's skin crawl. Despite the evidence, Christopher remained outwardly composed. He offered no detailed confession at first, only a vague statement of remorse in a letter. Yet, the detectives were certain of one fact. He had killed Catherine, and he had tried to erase every trace. Every lie he told, every evasive glance, every carefully measured step, spoke volumes. Police then focused on the apartment he shared with his girlfriend. Blood stains on the carpet, on the pillow where he had slept, and traces on objects confirmed a violent struggle had occurred. Experts swabbed, photographed, and documented everything. The crime scene told a story of calculated brutality and chilling premeditation. Christopher's attempts to claim memory lapses could not withstand the evidence from Catherine's fingernails. DNA collected from her defensive wounds unequivocally pointed to him. The struggle had been fierce, her last moments filled with terror and resistance. Every piece of evidence aligned: the surveillance footage, the forensic findings, the witness accounts. As detectives pieced the puzzle together, the true horror of that night in September 2015 unfolded. Catherine, a woman of courage and service, had met her end at the hands of someone she barely knew, someone she had trusted enough to speak to, laugh with, and share a fleeting connection. Justice, however, was moving closer. Christopher Grainer's arrest marked a turning point in the investigation. The meticulously constructed lies, the carefully staged plans, the feigned innocence, all were beginning to crumble under the weight of truth. The community, while shocked and mourning, finally felt a glimmer of hope. For Catherine, there could be no undoing, but for the detectives, bringing her killer to justice became an all-consuming mission. The story was dark, tragic, and terrifying, but the wheels of accountability had begun to turn. The courtroom in Nova Scotia was packed, a heavy silence hanging over everyone present. Friends, family, and local residents came to witness the trial that would decide the fate of Christopher Grainer, the man responsible for Catherine Campbell's brutal murder. The tension was palpable. Even seasoned officers seemed uneasy as the proceedings began. The prosecution laid out the evidence meticulously. Surveillance footage, forensic analysis, and witness testimonies painted a horrifyingly clear picture of that night. Catherine, a dedicated officer, had been lured, strangled, and beaten by someone she barely knew, someone she had trusted enough to interact with. DNA evidence taken from under her fingernails directly linked Christopher to her final struggle. Every element of the case was woven together with chilling precision. The defense tried to argue otherwise. They claimed that the encounter had been consensual at first, escalating into an accidental death. They suggested Christopher's amnesia was genuine, that he had no recollection of the events, and that post-traumatic stress had influenced his behavior. The courtroom murmured in disbelief. No one could ignore the overwhelming physical evidence, the blood-stained blanket, or the meticulously traced movements captured on surveillance cameras. Witnesses were called to testify about Catherine's dedication to the community, her caring nature, and her unwavering commitment to the safety of others. Friends spoke of her cheerful personality, her love for helping children, and the small acts of kindness that defined her life. Their stories clashed violently with the gruesome truth of her final hours, amplifying the horror of Christopher's crime. Christopher took the stand, calm yet detached, denying knowledge of the murder and attempting to paint himself as confused and remorseful. But his carefully constructed story fell apart under relentless cross-examination. Questions about the blood evidence, the surveillance footage, and the inconsistencies in his statements exposed the cracks in his defense. Every lie unraveled, piece by piece, until the courtroom could see the full magnitude of his guilt. The jury deliberated for a tense week. Outside, the town waited, holding its collective breath. Families of victims, colleagues, and citizens alike felt the weight of justice hanging in the balance. Finally, the verdict was delivered. Christopher Grainer was found guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted with a mix of relief, grief, and anger. Sentencing followed, and Christopher was given life imprisonment. The community felt a measure of closure, yet the scars of that horrific night lingered. Catherine's legacy, however, continued to shine. Her family organized events in her memory, helping at-risk children and promoting the values she had dedicated her life to. Even in death, she inspired a sense of vigilance and care within the community. Justice had been served, but the story remained a haunting reminder. Evil can hide behind the calmest of faces, and the fight for accountability often comes at the highest emotional cost. The town of Nova Scotia would never forget Catherine Campbell, the brave officer whose life was stolen too soon.